Hello, and welcome to Ancestral Healing 101. My name is Nicole Born Crow. I am a co-founder of Folke Healing, and I'm really happy that you're joining me here today for this recording. So, my hope for this, whenever and wherever you're watching this, that you are able to find some ways to reconnect to your lineages, to your culture, to your ancestors, and that you find some sweetness and some healing from that place. Before we go any further, I want to just extend an invitation wherever you are to perhaps shut your eyes and allow yourself to land here fully in this moment. Letting go of everything that's happened in your day so far. And extending some acknowledgments to each and every one of you, wherever you are, acknowledging the land that I rest upon here in Northeast Ohio in the United States, original land of the Haudenosaunee peoples. Gratitude for allowing me to rest here, to steward this land. Gratitude for all the ways in which this land supports me and my family. And gratitude to you and the land that you situate on and that you steward. Just asking that you find here whatever it is that you're looking for. And may you feel supported by your ancestors in all the ways that you can see and perhaps ways that you cannot see. And may this work begin to fan out, breaking cycles of power and supremacy and empire, allowing us all to imagine a new world of collective healing and liberation. May it be so. Kenya Hiratson. So let's talk for a minute about what you'll be covering in your workshop. So we've already done our welcome and acknowledgement. Next, we'll go into who I am. We'll talk about how and why do we connect, what it is to connect with our ancestors, and the framework of the lineage repair practitioners training that I have worked with. And then we will finish it up with a guided practice. So I'll talk for just a minute about who I am, who you're joining for this workshop. My name is Nicole, as I said. My pronouns are she, her. I'm an organizer. I am an ancestral lineage repair practitioner, an astrologer, a ritualist, and a mother. Those are just some of my identities. My people are Ashkenazi Jews from Austria-Hungary, Lebanese, Italian, German, and Swiss. I approach all of the work that I do, whether it's lineage repair or astrology, from a lens of collective liberation and cultural reconnection and healing. I believe that all of the things that we do should be viewed through trying to connect to our own practices, our own folk magics. Some of my special interests are working with those who have some difficult disconnections, whether it's persecution or assimilation. I also really like working with folks who are brand new to this work. I myself really struggled when I first approached it, and so I bring a lot of gentleness and understanding to approaching ancestors and anything having to do with your intuition. I also really love working with people that are disabled or neurodivergent, queer folks, and parents or caregivers. So let's talk for a bit about why people come to ancestor work. There's lots of different reasons. This isn't an exhaustive list, but this is just a few of the things that I've seen that people come to this work for and that folks walk away getting from this. So the first one is cultural disconnection. This is a big one. Most of us situated in the United States were raised in a very Western assimilated culture. And so for lots of different reasons, colonization, forced migration, enslavement, persecution. We've lost connection with our cultures and our ways. And so for those coming to this work, a big part of it is, how do I make connections with my people and with the ways of my people? And so lots of folks can walk away with a feeling of identity, of rootedness, of knowing who they are in the world a little bit better once we start to connect the threads of who our people were and their practices. We'll talk a little bit more about this later on, but it's a big reason that people come. Along these same lines, a lot of folks have many different cultures in their background, sometimes 4, 6, 8 different lineages, different cultures. And that can feel really hard to contain. We can feel quite fragmented when we're trying to embody all of that goodness. And sometimes we contain lineages that are opposites, colonized and colonizer. And so how do we bring a little bit of harmony and a little bit of integration to just a big, beautiful mess of lineages that we can contain and that we hold? The next reason that folks come is spiritual disconnection. For the most part, making a really vast generalization, folks that are like Gen X, Gen Z, and Millennial are pretty checked out from mainstream dogmatic religion. That's not everyone, but as I said, it's a generalization. And we don't really have anything that fills that hole in just the right way. We have lots of wellness culture, lots of, closed practices and gentrification of certain things that, again, aren't really filling the place of what it is to be connected to something sacred and something bigger than ourselves. So some come to this work looking for what it is to spiritually connect with our ancestors. And it's important to remember that all of our ancestors, no matter where they came from, if you go far back enough, had some sort of practices of ancestor connection. So ancestors were not only something that they gave reverence to, but it was a source of support for our ancestors to connect and to have those people. And so for many, this can be a spiritual practice unto itself, has nothing to do with any other mainstream religions, but is a way for us to find power and connection to something bigger through just our own lineages. Another reason that folks come to this work is intergenerational trauma. Most of us have a pretty good understanding from a psychological lens what intergenerational trauma is. But we don't have a good framework. The DSM doesn't have like what do you do with epigenetics and what do you do with cycles of trauma in our body? And so we have, Western psychology, which is important, and we should all be in therapy. But there's something really important and beautiful about weaving in what is it to actually relate to our ancestors, to understand the cycles that we've inherited, and try to weave those practices together a little bit. So some of us come to this work because we know some of the stories of our people, and we know that there's some healing that needs to be done. Or we have some really terrible parents or grandparents and lived trauma ourselves, and we just have to be the cycle breakers for these perpetuated cycles of intergenerational trauma. And so this work can be very important and very healing for that reason. And the last one is ghosty interferences and curses. And I kind of say this in a joking manner, but a lot of people come to this work because there's a loved one that perhaps recently died and they're feeling their presence. Their dreams are getting weird and they don't quite know what to do about it. Or just some bad stuff has been happening. Things that feel like curses, repetitive bad luck or bad health or accidents that are happening. Some of those more severe ones are a bit above my pay grade, but there are lots of wonderful folks I could refer you to. but coming to this work for some of the more positive things, like a grandparent having recently passed, is a beautiful reason to come to this work, because it invites us to embark on some relationality with those that have passed, not just with the recently deceased, but then building a framework for how to relate to our whole lineages and all of our ancestors. So, also a really wonderful reason to be doing this work. So, next, let's touch on why. Why do we have to relearn this? Why do things have to be hard? Many of us have no framework for ancestor connection. So when I say we've lost connection with the practice, it's because we don't have a framework, and perhaps many of us didn't even know that ancestral connection was something that we lost connection with. We didn't know that our, German, Anglo ancestors had any of these practices. So relearning the ways of connection can be bumpy. It can be filled with a lot of Western doubt, and the need to know for sure something, or to have things that are tangible. So that can be really, really hard. We want evidence, and while evidence-based things are very important, when we kind of wade into spiritual practice, things like culture and reconnection with something like ancestors, it isn't always something that can be easily measured and can be easily contained. We've touched on a lot of the reasons why we are so disconnected. Ethnic and religious cleansing has sanitized or depaganized a lot of religions and faith practices. So there's been a lot of forced disconnection by many different hands, that has really torn us from our practices of how we connect with our own idea of what the sacred is. We're also made to believe that ancestral connection only belongs to some cultures, some faiths, when really it's just because those are the only ones that have intact ancestral connection practices. And while I do not want anyone here stealing from closed practices from other cultures, I think it's a really important invitation to look back within your own lineages and do some investigation as to how your people may have related to their ancestors. I promise you they did if you go back far enough. And so, again, just a gentle invitation to reimagine, reconnect with what it is that your people may have done to revere and to connect with their ancestors. So, my last little point is that it's hard. We have to flex this muscle. We have to relearn what it is to be in relation with more than the human world, and relearn the ways that our people feel in our body, relearn what it is to make offerings, and be in a world we're not so alone in. This is really, really hard, but it is a learnable skill. So if you are embarking on ancestral reconnection or lineage repair, I'm telling you now, a lot of the times it's going to feel like you're making things up. And if you're approaching this from just a purely psychological or historical lens, then that's fine. You can rest at I'm making this up. But for those of you who are ready to get down with a little bit of woo-woo, if you're ready to kind of engage in this in a spiritual way, just know that it's going to feel really hard at first, and maybe for a while. But just to kind of jump in, lean in, keep an open mind and an open heart, and just know that whatever you bring to this, you can still come away with a lot of beautiful healing. So the next thing, we'll do a little bit of story time about my background. I think it's helpful for me as a practitioner to give you some context to what experience, what humans I bring into this practice. None of this work is mine. All of this is from my ancestors, other people's ancestors, and ancient practices. So I think it's important to situate myself. And it also speaks to some of the power and kind of transformative capacity of what it is to finally be in relation with your people. So I grew up like many other Western, suburban, white people, secular in the United States in the age of capitalism and late stage capitalism. But for me, from a very young age, I was always seeking some sort of connection, seeking in so many different ways. Like a lot of other people in my late 30s, mid 30s, I went through, a little bit of a midlife crisis, a little dark night of the soul. Mine was compounded a little bit by having it happen during COVID. And then also during COVID, my oldest child being hospitalized repeatedly for his complex medical needs and disabilities. And so that really thrusts a person into a lot of self examination. I was in therapy, I was dabbling in astrology, and it was about the same time that I felt this kind of sudden, urgent pull towards genealogy, which I actually think is a very normal thing as you are going through your developmental phases. That eventually you start to think about, where did I come from? What is my legacy? What am I here to do? So it was around this time during this research phase that I discovered my secret Jewish lineage. So it was something that had been hidden, buried deep by my grandfather. So my father and his brother and I and all of my cousins truly had no idea what it was that my grandfather experienced, what his youth actually was. My grandfather having survived labor camps during World War II, and all of his brothers having perished in different concentration camps. So, knowing this, learning this, it felt like suddenly pieces of my puzzle, of things that I maybe had secretly suspected or known on some level, all started to click into place. But I did feel like, though I was researching and learning so much about myself, and it was life changing, truly, truly life changing, I also felt like I needed a container for this grief and this joy and just all of these things that were kind of falling into place. More than just me making family trees on Ancestry or bugging my family with new discoveries. I needed community and I needed some of the things that I was working through to be witnessed in a collective and in community. So that is when I discovered ancestral healing. Lots of different places, but ancestral medicine is the place that really resonated with me. So the rest of my story is probably very similar to yours. Lots of assimilation, lots of cultural disconnection, something that's very, very common for those in the United States. This framework, though, has really shown me how to come home, how to reclaim and embody all of those disconnected, assimilated lineages, but also how to embody and process all of these wounds, all of these things that I was carrying that I had no idea I was carrying with me. So it's worked that has helped me step more fully into my identities and brought me finally into connection with the thing I had been seeking all along. So that's my story time. I hope one day to learn a little bit about your story as well. So let's talk for a moment about the roots and the framework of lineage repair. As I know it, as I practice it, and as I was trained, lineage repair only requires a few things of you. As I touched on, you do not have to have a certain framework for faith or belief in anything in particular, but there are a few things that are really helpful to be open to want to learn more about in order to be open to the frameworks of this repair process. So the first one is an openness to the idea that there is something greater than us. And this something greater can be lots of different things. Unlike therapy work in the United States, which is Western, for the most part developed by white Western men, which focus on each of us healing in isolation. So a lot of individualism baked into how we approach healing in the United States. Ancestor work requires us to be in relationality. So with that comes coming to this work with perhaps an openness to a sense of awe, a sense of being supported by something greater than us. So this can be a little tricky for folks who are atheist or for those with religious trauma. So lots of ex-evangelicals coming to this work and having to go slowly. Remembering that you're something bigger does not have to be a deity or a god or a goddess. Coming to this work with the openness that something bigger could be love, could be the Big Bang, could be the spark of creation. For people who are very new, I ask sometimes, what was it that you talked to when you were a child? What did you talk to when you were scared or when you were joyful, before you were told to no longer talk to that thing? Or if you are an artist or an arts appreciator, thinking back to a time when you looked at a piece of art or a poem or a piece of writing and it gave you a bodily experience. It for a moment thrust you into the stream of feeling connected, feeling connected to something that was just bigger than yourself and outside of yourself. So that something bigger can be something like that as well. Lots of ways that we can come to this work. Relationality also talks about how are we in relation to things that are other than human. So plants, animals, which brings us to our second thing, an openness to the animist belief that we are connected to other than humans. So with this, again, we're talking about plants, animals, spirits, or memories of those that came before us, and that we are all interconnected. Relationality with the earth, with the stink bugs even, and opening up those pathways to being relational. How do we move through the world differently when we view a piggy or a stink bug and a flower with the same inherent value as our own? How do we relate to the land and its cycles and its resources, not as something for us to own or for us to profit from, but as something that belongs wholly unto itself? So this is a beautiful place to start the work from when we investigate how our ancestors connected to their ancient practices and to the land. Very often, it was through these earth-honoring animist belief systems. And the last is an openness to the idea that life continues in some form after we die. You would think that this is the one that I think is the most important, but actually I think that this might be the least important. Because we don't, none of us have the answers. None of us know what happens after we die, though some would like us to believe that they know what happens. But for the purposes of doing this work, for whatever reasons, landing perhaps on a maybe ancestors exist is the perfect place to start from. Because from that place of maybe, you can welcome in the idea that maybe we can communicate with our ancestors. Maybe we can affect those that have passed. And then it opens up the idea that maybe we have a whole community of ancestors, of family, of land, of vocation or community that are supporting us, that are at our back. And then the universe starts to feel a lot less lonely, and we don't feel so much like a random collection of cells, but more like the culmination of thousands of people that came before us, and that they are at our back, rooting and supporting us. Now, I put two kind of grumpy elders in this picture to illustrate that just like not all living family members are awesome, not all ancestors are equally well and awesome. Some of our ancestors were colonizers, slave traders, Nazis. Some of us contain both of those things. And so this is a really big reason why some people come to this work. The reason that I love this specific framework that I practice is that it puts a really big emphasis on ritual safety, which is important when you're dealing with ancestors or elders that you remember that have passed that caused trauma and caused harm. It's better to bring ritual safety, even if you don't believe in any of this, just in case, so we can invite those not so well ancestors to just take a few steps back from us, from getting in our business a little bit. So, indirect connection. We're going to talk now about how do we connect. And indirect connection is one of the wonderful ways. Whether you ever do any ancestral healing work with me or anyone ever again, if you are looking for some ways to build practices in your daily life that are just everyday reasonable things, these are some really great ones that we're going to talk through. The first one we'll start with is altars and ancestor reverence. This is a really beautiful and easy thing that you can do. You can put an altar just about anywhere. It can be on a windowsill, it can be on the top of a piano or a shelf. You can get an actual little altar of some sort or build yourself something. On your altar can go truly anything that feels intuitively right to be on your altar. So, whether it's flowers, foods, sweets, lots of people put sacred waters or wine, pictures of your loved ones, inherited heirlooms are a really beautiful thing. Sometimes it's beautiful to just see what does it feel like your ancestors want you to put there for them. Someone asked a really great question in the live session. Can I have an altar that has all of my ancestors and all of my lineages? And the answer is absolutely yes. You don't have to have a separate altar for each lineage. You can sometimes put specific items on your altar at specific times. For instance, if you're celebrating a yard site or an anniversary of the loss of a loved one, or if there's a specific lineage that you're looking to really strengthen your connection to, then you can kind of put a little bit more things there just for them. But in general, no, your altars can be for everyone, and they can be a place for you to not only offer some reverence and some offerings, but it's also a place for you to receive support. So whether it's stopping there for a moment every day and just having a moment of quiet, perhaps you meditate, and this is a place where you can bring your meditation practices. There's lots of reasons and lots of purposes that having an ancestor altar practice can really enhance and serve. The next one is fairly kind of obvious, and I bet a lot of you are doing it already. Things like daily routines, like cooking, crafting, singing. Um, the difference is how do we bring mindful intention to these things? So perhaps inviting your ancestors into the kitchen with you. A lot of us have at least one recipe that we inherited from an ancestor or a grandparent. So how do we invite them in as we're in the kitchen? How do we work with herbs and plants that are from our lineages that we can mindfully connect with? Things like crafting, where they're handicrafts or arts that your lineages had as a part of their culture, where they're languages, songs, prayers, truly dances, anything that make you feel like you are working to embody your cultural lineage. So much of what we do in the West is all up here, so like neck up. And so some of this work of indirect connection and even direct connection is how do we somatically start to embody our people and start to feel them in our bodies? The next one is our actions and the work that we do and our creative expressions. So this one kind of involves more of like a zooming out and thinking, how are the things that I do in my life perhaps a reflection or an inheritance of who my people were? Do you come from a lineage of healers, of nurses or doctors or teachers? Do you have ancestors that were radical organizers or medicine people or artists? It's really beautiful to think that there's a decent chance that all of the ways that you show up and identify in the world, your ancestors, at least a few of them, were also that way. So it's beautiful to examine how I move through the world, how I express myself in this life. How is that also an inheritance of my people? And how can I claim that as an inheritance of who my people were? The last one, our senses, our memories, and our imagination. Senses kind of fits in a little bit with the cooking and the crafting, but I think it deserves its own because you cannot underestimate the power of smell and of taste and of touch as a mindful pathway to reconnect with your people. I will never not eat a raspberry or pick a peach or smell chamomile and not directly think of my Oma. And so, how can you explore lineage connection through your senses? Memory seems like an easy one, but I think one that we could always bring more intention to, even in a ritual way. How do we ritualize our memories with our ancestors? And imagination is a big thing in some of the work that you do in direct connection. But thinking about our imaginations are actually so very connected to who our people were. The cool thing about all of these is that even if you think the ancestors don't exist, you think this is all absolute bollocks, we are connected on a scientific level in our whole bodies every day to our people. You know, our DNA was their DNA first. So our tastes, our affinities, the brain matter that comprises how we think and feel and imagine literally came from the building blocks of who our ancestors were. So I sometimes like to think like my thoughts are truly and literally from my people. And so when I get really bogged down by like, I'm just making this all up, or oh, this is just my imagination, which it might be, and that's totally fine. I also like to remember that my brain is my ancestors' brain. So my imagination is my ancestors' imagination. My thought patterns are their thought patterns. So hopefully some of this work is helping you to realize all of the ways that your ancestors do live in your body, whether you do any ancestral lineage repair work or not. The next thing I want to touch on is direct connection, which is some of the work of lineage repair. Direct connection on one level looks a lot like guided meditation practices, but then it starts to also weave in the concept of felt sensing and intuitive perception. So, intuitive perception happens through what's called the clair senses. So, things like clairvoyance, claircognizance, clairaudience. It's information from consciousness that's interpreted through our sensory impressions. So sometimes this feels like a physical or sensory perception. Sometimes it's like what a daydream feels like, or when we dream at night. So the practice of sensing input from outside of ourselves, and how are we sensing it? I'll invite you during the guided practice to really bring some noticing. How do you visualize things when you're in a guided practice, when you meditate? Do you visualize? Do you know? Do you sense things in your body? This is a tricky skill. And so, very often, when new clients come to me, we spend a lot of time here. This is not something that we're taught. So, it's relearning the skill of what it is to sense things that are outside of our direct field of sensory perception. So, this is a skill that definitely needs a lot of practice. And finally, lineage repair. It's the thing we've kind of been leading up to, but it's not always the most exciting to talk about processes. So the method that I am trained in is ancestral medicine, which was developed by psychologist and ritualist Dr. Daniel Four. And it's a healing modality based off of all the things that we were talking about: cultural reconnection, reconnecting with our ancestors, and bringing some healing and repair. It's typically about a 5-step process, but for me, it ends up sometimes being 6 or 7, depending on where a new client is starting. If all of this feels a little bit too spiritual or a little bit too woo-woo, I invite you to suspend your disbelief. Think of it as a psychological practice like parts work or internal family systems. But here's just a little brief overview of what this work can entail. Step one, we start with the thing that we just talked about, felt sensing and intuitive perception. And then once we feel like we have a good framework for that, we move on to what is called the lineage assessment. So it's essentially observing the wellness, the unwellness, and the impact of our 4 primary blood lineages. And then that kind of guides and informs which lineage we start with. Step 2 is finding a guide along the lineage. Now, I know that there are a lot of different frameworks out there for how we embark on this work, but remember how I said I loved this practice because it focuses a lot on ritual safety. The guide is not grandma or grandpa. It is not someone recently deceased, unless you come from a long line of connected, earth honoring peoples, in which case maybe it is. But typically, when we're talking about a guide, who is the one leading this work for you? You're looking for someone that is way, way back when your people were connected to earth honoring ways, back before disruption and disconnection. So we're talking sometimes about, a few thousand years back. And so that is what brings a little bit of ritual safety, is that we are not starting with our most recent known traumas. We are connecting with a wise, well, loving ancestor far back on our lineage, typically. Sometimes for people, this can be a human. This can also be a symbol or a plant or an animal or an element. The next step is making a ritual container around the lineage. I like to think of this as similar to when you're doing something like EMDR or you're in therapy, and you're making a ritual container of safety for big things that are coming up. And that way you can provide a little bit of distance from emotional flooding, things that can feel too intense or unsafe. And so building a ritual container between you and the guide on this lineage and enveloping all of those ancestors in between in a container that brings some beautiful concentration for any ancestors that may be very unwell or very dispersed and disconnected. And so that container can kind of concentrate that healing. And at the same time, it provides some ritual safety and some distance between you and the healing work that is happening. A lot of this healing work is actually being done by the guide. And so a lot of our role is witnessing and receiving information from our guide and our ancestors. And so, again, so much ritual safety is built into this practice. The next step is kind of 3A, 3B. It's receiving some of the stories of our people through our guide. What were the blessings, the beautiful gifts of your people? And what are some of the burdens and the traumas and the wounds that your people carry? And how do those live in you? How are you kind of a receptacle for both the goodness and some of the traumas of your people? Step 4 is about starting to receive the healed ancestors outside of that ritual container and allowing them to take their place along that wider web of ancient ancestors. At this step, when we're talking about a long, long time ago, this usually happens in spans of time. So, decades or hundreds of years at a time. And then when we get to step 5, receiving and welcoming the recent dead, things start to slow down a little bit. We start to have some names for these people. Perhaps we even knew them in life. And so we bring a little bit more care and just a little bit more slowness to what it is to welcome a healed version of these people into the wider web of ancestors. The last step is all about you. It's about you embodying the new, upgraded, healed, and vibrant state of this lineage. What is it to actually in your body receive that goodness and start to take your place as the face of this lineage and all of the beautiful goodness that you inherited from them. And what is it to start to shine that goodness onto the world, not just to keep it to ourselves, but what is it to start to repair the cycles of harm and to bring that healing goodness and shine it outwards? The last thing that I will touch on is, how is healing work political? So I think that healing work in general is political, but ancestral healing in particular is political. So if the work that we're doing does not include uplifting others, breaking cycles of harm, then we will just continue to enact those cycles of supremacy and harm, full stop. So ancestral reconnection can be one of the antidotes for colonization and to empire. One of the main tools of empire is cultural erasure, disconnection from people, disconnection from their language, land, and ways. We see this happening in real time right now. The United States wrote the book on how to do this. And so the work that we are doing to heal, it cannot end with us. It must include how do we repair these cycles that are playing out in real time that are very much caused by our people, for the most part. And so cultural reclamation, reclaiming our ways, our folk practices, our medicines, our land is radical and political. There's so much collective power in each of us reconnecting to exactly who we are and finding our community and our liberation from centering in that place. For those of you tuning in after the workshop, I decided to include the guided practice as just an audio, so you'll be receiving that separately. I just wanted to take a moment to thank you for coming to this work for whatever reason you decided to bring your curiosity, whatever it is that's pulling you towards your ancestors. I'm here for any questions that you might have. I hope that this met you in whatever ways that you were needing it to. I wish you so much goodness in reconnecting with your people, and please don't hesitate to reach out if you have any questions. Thank you so much and take good care.